Good morning, everybody. Thank you for asking me to participate in this. I have to start with my conflict of interest. So I've consulted for a number of places in the past 24 months, and my partner owns Consulting, but none of those have any bearing on what I'm about to say. So my learning objectives are, so I need to shrink this because I can't see my slides. Okay, at the conclusion of this course, you should be able to appreciate that having a great idea in an experiment is only one component of writing a grant, which is only one component of submitting a grant, which is only one component of having a grant funded. We heard Dr. Tweary multiple times yesterday saying, you have a great idea, but you have to compete with other people to make sure that yours is the one that's chosen. I want you to know to consider all the other people that are involved in a grant submission. Know the importance of having others review your grant before it's submitted. I realize yesterday may have been painful, but it's much better than that actually being the first time your grant was reviewed and you're having to wait 9 months to find out how it was reviewed and having to, you can do something about it now. Know the importance of having an elevator speech, which is also part of this idea about communication, which is what grantsmanship is. And consider the grant text from a reviewer's perspective. That also came up yesterday when we talked about not having too small font, having a picture on each slide, things like that. So you might have noticed that my idea about grantsmanship is about communication more than your science. I'm not going to talk very much about your science today. I'm going to talk about grantsmanship in terms of communicating your ideas and being respectful and understanding with who's seeing your grant and who's working on your grant. Acknowledgements are, I used information from Dr. Sankari's talk last year and Dr. Boland. Thank you very much for reviewing this talk. So to get started, basic recommendations. Number one, preparing, writing, and submitting a grant reflects your organizational and communication skills in addition to your experimental skills. And you need organization and communication in order to have a successful experimental work and for your career. I sometimes say that writing a grant is like writing a sonnet. There's this format, and then you have to be creative within it, but you still need to follow the original format. Number two, your poor planning is not the admin's emergency. So when I first started as a fellow, that was the sign above the admin's desk. Your poor planning is not my emergency. Please be respectful, follow their deadlines. Yours is not the only one they were working on, and they also need to read all the instructions related to your grant. What we do at Mass General is we submit a dummy grant so they can start working on the paperwork. Ask them to make any changes that they do, and then you can continue working on other sections. And we can talk more about this later. The other idea about your poor planning is also your poor planning is not your mentor's emergency. Now, your mentor might try really hard and be very responsive, but please don't give them something 2 days before it's due. They have lots of other things to do. Just remember that you are, this isn't, this is a big world. You're a big person, boy or girl, and you are not the only person that other people are working with, and you should be respectful of their time. Plan on starting writing, not preparation, but writing at least 8 to 12 weeks before the due date. Your preparation has to start before then. And if you're working with a good mentor, you should expect at least 4 rounds of edits with them. And each of those rounds, if your mentor has other things to do, may take 3 to 4 days. When I review grants with people, with my mentees, we probably do 8 rounds of edits. So as I said, your mentor will also have other projects, so don't expect immediate attention. I mean, it's good. I try my best, but I can't necessarily do that. Include the section title, abstract, specific aims, something like that at the top of the page. The NIH Assist program does not do this, and the reviewers will appreciate knowing what they're reading, but yes, you lose a line. My other advice is to make one document with all the science in it: your abstract, your narrative, your specific aims, your research strategy, and your references, and one document with everything else. I do this for several reasons. One is it makes it easier to go back and forth among them. And as you'll hear me say, and others will say over and over again, the entire grant has to be coherent. And therefore, if you make changes in one section, you're going to want to make changes in other sections. And it's easier if you're not opening and closing multiple documents. you can also make the formatting uniform so it looks more professional. To me, it doesn't look professional if the formatting of one document looks different than the formatting of another document. Also, the other document with everything else is usually things that you can finish much easier. I mean, much earlier than everything else. You know, your biosketch can be done, your facilities can be done, your budget justification, all those can be done much earlier. And so you don't have to keep on thinking about them. Though once again, I tend to do one document with all of those so that once again, the formatting looks professional. If somebody sends you something, edit it with permission, especially other people's biosketches and letters to make sure that they're relevant to your project. So I have people send them to me. I edit them if necessary, and then I send it back for their permission to use it. And almost everybody says yes. For example, I am working on a grant right now with a consultant, and the consultant's letter was very different than what I thought we agreed that the consultant was going to do. And if I hadn't read the letter and hopefully have time to get it back to him, it would look odd that the consultant's letter didn't do what I said. Also things related to statement of work. And so usually when I have a subcontract, I ask for the subcontractor to send me all of their materials, including their statement of work and their facilities and everything, to once again make sure that it's consistent with your grant. BioSketches also is a chance for you to establish that you have a relationship with somebody, what they're going to do with you, and once again, you want to be able to edit that. And since you're editing, you need version control of your documents. I think it should be in the title of the document, so either version 1 or version 2 or the date. I make a new version every day once I start working really intensively on a grant, so that if something happens bad, I can find it again, or if something I've deleted, I want to keep, and then decide how somebody's indicated that they've reviewed or edited the document. You don't want them to rewrite over your document because you don't know what they've done. And what I usually do is ask people to put a dash and then their initials at the end, because then I also know which version they edited. Sometimes it takes them 4 days to get back to me, and I have a new version by then. And so I'm going to want to know which version they edited. Also, please don't save something that says, as I got earlier this week, specific aims, not from my mentee, but from somebody else. It was like, this is now going to sit somewhere on my computer. I'm not going to be able to find it. I don't know what version it is. I don't know anything like that. So this is no longer college where you turn in something and you never see it again. You need to have version control. And then, as we said yesterday, at one point in time, we'll say again, you are responsible for the grant, not your admin. You are responsible. And then that means you have to check the final version before it's uploaded. You should open and look at every PDF, because especially if somebody else has made the PDF for you, things can get moved around, or the margins will change depending on how they've made it, and suddenly things look funky. It's easier to tell if the final version actually contains what you think is the final version if the PDFs have version control in the title. Like my admin tends to write, save the PDF as something like specific aims. And I then usually actually re-upload every PDF in an NIH grant with a name so that I know if I've changed something. But you have to discuss this with your admin, because some places don't like the PI working in an assist, only the admin working with the assist. Getting a little more into other things related to grantsmanship, I think it's really important that you use uniform terms. So this, and related to the uniform order of lists, is you don't want the reviewers to think. I know this sounds odd, but you want to lead them down a path where they only think your way, like a horse with blinders. You don't want them to think of anything else. And anytime that you use a different word than what they're expecting, or you use a different list order or something, they need to stop and think, is this the same or different than before? And you don't want them to do that. You want them to just continuously think the way you want them to do it. Okay. Be consistent across all sections of the grant. And in other words, how you define something, what's important, things like that. I can't tell you the number of grants I read in which there's inconsistencies. And as a matter of fact, as Jared said yesterday, you're supposed to rate a grant from 1 to 9, and most people sort of do it in the better numbers. I once actually gave a grant a 9. I checked with the SRO before I did, but the grant had different numbers of people being enrolled in different parts of the grant and different durations of enrollment in the grant. And while this was, I could say, was primarily scientific, and therefore I supposedly could give better numbers to the investigators, I said that indicated the investigators hadn't read the grant and they were sloppy. And that the grant, I didn't even know what grant I was reviewing. So be consistent across all sections of the grant. As we discussed yesterday, consider a figure with a theme or your hypothesis. This is helpful, but not necessary. I think it's very helpful to learn how to use word styles. It helps with outlining. It reduces odd formatting and fonts, which can sometimes happen when you make a PDF. And you should also learn how to make a PDF from a selection of the document. I had to teach my admin how to do this. He was taking a section I wanted, copying it to another format, and then creating another file, and then creating a new PDF from that. And that was changing margins. It was changing all sorts of other things. So you should learn how to do that from a section of the document. Okay, so that was the overall. Start preparing 6 to 9 months before the deadline. And once again, this comes back to communication and the ideas of that you don't just do this by yourself. So by yourself, you identify the scope of your question, but you should also do that in communications with other people. You're talking about science. You should enjoy doing this. Think about what you want to do. Discuss it with people. Identify a funding source. Look for announcements, including notice of special interest. Read the instructions, especially the focus, intent, and keywords given. This was discussed a little yesterday, where Dr. Tweary was talking about a U grant versus a K grant versus an R grant. And different grants, for example, have different focuses. So the R21 is a high risk, high impact, and an R01 is a basic understanding of a question and should not be about a method or technique, but what they actually answer. And then you also want to choose so that is sort of a communication, deciding what's the best way to get your grant funded, basically. And then you want to choose the agency, and you also definitely want to choose the study section. So identify your team of co-investigators and the resources, talk to them, figure out what you can do, and also notify your institution. There may be internal forms or internal due dates. I think somebody else may be discussing this. I just want to make sure that people know about the Pivot RP database. I find it's really helpful. You give it keywords, and I get weekly updates about grants. Needless to say, 90% of them are not useful, but there are things that occasionally come up. So your institution will hopefully have access to this database. Your institution may also have grant search engines, and then Sleep Research Society and ASM and other organizations also sponsor grants. Though I hear about those also through the Pivot database. Okay, so the next idea is this elevator speech. As Dr. Tweary said multiple times to you guys yesterday, and has said multiple times to me in the past, why is your project important now? I teach all my trainees that they should have a 1 sentence, a 3 sentence, and a 3-minute version of what they're doing. You should write it down and refine it, and then you should practice it out loud, not by email, not on paper, with people. This really helps clarify your idea and how to present your idea. And it really helps you clarify your idea, and it will also help you actually write the grant because you've clarified it. It's also useful for when you're introduced to people at conferences. So I had three medical students from a traditionally Black medical school. They worked with me one summer. They were fantastic, and I took them around the sleep meetings. And the first time I introduced them to somebody who's relatively famous in the field, they sort of stopped because they'd read this person's papers, and I said, "What's your elevator speech? You know, you have a 1 sentence. We practiced it." And of course, this person was genuine and wonderful. And as soon as the first sentence came out, they could start the conversation. But meanwhile, they were just frozen until they came up with the 1 sentence. Then the person asked them a question. Then they had their 3 sentences, and then they were off and going. So it's also useful for you when you're introduced with people that you're going, "Oh my goodness, I'm finally meeting this person." You have this set so that you don't sound like you don't know what you're talking about or what you want to do. So I'm going to talk briefly about the abstract and the specific aims, mostly in terms of communication issues rather than the science, because other people will talk about that. So the abstract and the specific aims may be the only sections that non-assigned readers will read. It's a conceptual framework for the work, and it should be able to stand alone. So it has no references. Therefore, you need to include everything that's important without detail, and you need to write for a scientist without specialization in the field. So no jargon, write out acronyms, and write so the reviewer has a clear understanding of what you want to do and why. And I also think you should give them something they want to use, a 1 or 2 sentence maximum sentence that grabs them. And I frequently find if you have a really good one, then the reviewers will use it in the review text and in the discussion. So they're publicly available on NH Reporter. So look at other people's successful abstracts, and you should include the objective, the aims, the focus. You want to communicate these things. Notice there's very little in here I'm talking about. It's the actual science. You're trying to communicate the importance of the idea. And I already said that. I'm going to skip this right now. And I'm going to come back to this many times, in that you also have to communicate your idea and your grant with other people who are on your side before it goes to study section. So give it to people, rewrite, give it to people, rewrite. Specific aims are another conceptual framework for the work. And once again, this in the abstract may be the only sections the non-assigned reviewers who still can vote can read. It should be able to stand alone. And once again, you should include everything that's important without detail, and to write for a scientist without specialization in your field. Now you have 4 to 5 paragraphs instead of just 1 or 2. And I forgot to say, under the summary statement, I like to see, and not to the summary statement, under the abstract, I like to see 2 paragraphs instead of 1, because 1 paragraph of 30 lines is really sort of hard to read. The specific aims should be usually 3 or 4 aims. You should keep them short. You should be realistic about them. Overstating what you're going to do is an example of you're not really understanding what's involved in science. They should match the career goals of the K Award or whatever goal you're doing. And you should make sure that the first 3 paragraphs don't include more information that's needed to support the specific aims, and make sure the specific aims don't include information that's not in the first 3 paragraphs. I can't tell you, a number of times I've read somebody's specific aims where the first 3 paragraphs don't indicate why you have those specific aims, and or the specific aims include information that you haven't told me before why it's important. So this is part of the communication issue. You need to use the first couple paragraphs to tell me why you're doing the specific aims, and to explain why those specific aims are important. So the aims must be linked thematically, but they don't have to be directly. And I was taught that you shouldn't have one aim depend on the specific results of another, because then a reviewer will say, well, the first one didn't work out, and so therefore, what are you going to do with your second specific aim? You can be wrong about it. So Dr. Seisler, the division chief at the Brigham and Women's Sleep Division, had a program project grant from the National Institutes of Health for approximately 20 years, for which the original specific aim was wrong. Well, not wrong, the hypothesis was not proven, but it generated a huge number of very important data. You know enough about this study, about your field, that you should be able to say what you think is going to happen. You can be wrong, but you're going to have to defend it in the science part. And so don't say demonstrate or describe or exam or identify or explore. That sounds like a fishing expedition. You need to communicate that you know enough to do this. And so you can include some sort of expected outcomes, but you can't just say, we're going to investigate whether this happens, because then it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. I already said that. Okay. And I already said this. So next, amend your abstract and your specific aims using this criticism, and then rewrite the whole grant. Then go back to the abstract and specific aims. And this is why it's easier if it's all in one document. And then email your program officer and ask if you can talk about the proposal. Now, actually, I usually talk to the program officer earlier than this about the general idea. Program officers are great people, they're scientists, they want to hear about science rather than administrative work all the time. And so I usually talk to program officers, say, hey, this is what I think I'm interested in, maybe send them a couple sentences. Can I talk to you? Michael Tweary has been incredibly helpful. Unfortunately, sometimes really very blunt, but that was very helpful about whether or not what my idea was at all good. And then after I refined it, Michael Tweary and other people have been very helpful to go through the abstract and specific aims. Once again, sometimes more blunt than you want them to be, but it really helpful in the end. The science section demonstrates a specific project and that you can do it. And I'm only going to talk about innovation right now, because once again, innovation is part of this idea about communicating your ideas. So innovation is everything you can think of that hasn't been done and why you're doing this. So is it a different population? Is it different methods, different experiment, different data collected, different data analyses, a new collaboration, a different translational potential? This is really important. This is part of, as Michael Tweary said, trying to get people to understand why this needs to be done now. So the innovation, while most of the time it's relatively short, it can be very important because you're trying to convince people, which is what the grant is, convincing the people that you know how to do this, you're the person to do this. And as Michael kept on saying, why it needs to be done now over other important projects. And this is where you're going to tell them why it needs to be done now. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, biosketches should be revised for each grant. It's part of the communicating that you have either an arc in your research or that you've worked with other people in the grant or some other way of tying the whole grant together. And I'm almost done. Include a biostatistician early. They should be helping you plan the experiment, and they should be writing some text unless you have an advanced degree in statistics. They should be included in the budget of your grant for doing analyses. I've been on study sections where people have said there's no biostatistician on this grant, and I gave it a much worse score just because there wasn't a biostatistician on the grant, in addition to the fact that they're really great people. And having a biostatistician early can make a huge difference in your grant. And I'm trying to remember, somebody had a great quote about bringing in a biostatistician just to analyze the data is like, I'll think of some analogy, but anyway. Some departments provide a statistician for free for juniors faculty, especially for grant writing. So you should see if that's available to you. But once again, the statistician should be involved as you are planning the grant, as you're planning the experiment and possibly writing some of the text. See if there's an internal grant review program in your department, hospital, school, whatever. And if not, consider forming one. Peer review is fantastic, as we did yesterday. And then Mass General both has internal peer review, so postdocs and junior faculty with each other. And within the Department of Neurology, we've just started one with more senior faculty reading parts of people's grants. As I said, talk to the NIH program officer multiple times, the general idea, the review of aims, and also very important, talk with them about what study section you should use and include that request in the submission. So I have a grant that's right now at the 3rd percentile, so I'm hoping it's going to get funded. And the first time I went to the wrong study section, and it was they totally did not understand it at all. And the second time, basically the same grant, very few changes made from the first one, went to a different study section, and it got scored at the 11th percentile, and it was the beginning of COVID, and it didn't get funded. So now the third time it's at the 3rd percentile, and hopefully will be funded. So other advice, avoid irritating reviewers. As we said yesterday, don't make the font too small. Don't overcrowd the pages. I also find abbreviations and acronyms are sometimes an issue. Define them at the first use and repeat the definition in each section of the grant. So if you use it in the abstract, redefine it again in the specific aims and redefine it again in the research strategy section. And then once you've defined it, use it. Don't spell it out, especially if you're running short on time. You can use it. But use it. Avoid jargon, have somebody not in your lab group read the grant. And we've already talked about make it easy to read, including, I really like to have space between paragraphs. I think that's more easy to see than if you indent the first line of a paragraph and then you don't have space between paragraphs. So be persistent. Baseball, being a good hitter is greater than 30% and grants are worse. Tell a story. Remind yourself that you need to write grants so that you can do what you want, which are the experiments, and sharing the results of your experiments. And remember, this is only one part of your life. So I took a walk before this along the river, snowing gently, but it was really nice. And you have hopefully family and friends and other things to do in your life. And so write a grant, but also do other things. So thank you very much. I hope I'm in time, and I look forward to talking with all of you about this.